Two children.
Okay, so I hope you had a nice Shabbos. And I'm very happy to have you as our special guest this weekend. For everybody, Ben is the Deputy Director of the National Economic Crime Centre, part of the National Crime Agency. And thanks to Ben Tobin for organising this. Ben's going to be answering, we're going to have a conversation about crime and fraud, which is very relevant, Ben, because, you know, in shul, not that many of us were there, but this week we lay in the Ten Commandments, of which we have, obviously, do not steal and do not bear false witness lying in court. So lots of very relevant stuff for this. So I've got a whole bunch of questions that I've got, but also from Ben as well. So tell us your story. How did a nice Jewish boy from Hampton Garden suburb end up living a life of dealing with crime?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. Well, firstly, thank you for calling me a nice. So it's hard to answer that, really. What should I say? My father worked in the city as a lawyer, and he worked for one firm his whole life. So I knew I didn't want to do that.
Right.
And so when I left uni, I went to work for NOAM, the Masorti youth movement.
Right, I know well, yeah.
Which is brilliant, and I think it sort of worries me how I'm still dealing with work situations that are extremely complicated 10 years later, thinking, what would I have done at NOAM in terms of that situation? So certainly the most valuable training I had, and I didn't know what to do, so I got a job at the Serious Organised Crime Agency, and I think, which became the NCA. And I think there's something around kind of my generation. I think we have this sense that we're going to all work to 85 and have 7 different careers, and then I've turned around and 10 years later I'm still doing the same thing. I have no idea why, but if we are all going to work to 85, then maybe 10 years isn't that long. But I think the thing about the NCA, particularly compared to some other parts of policing, is it's quite a relatively small organisation with a lot of variety. So I'm a bit of an impatient person, and whenever I got bored of something, I just tried something else. But there's a lot of variety.
Are you more focused on cybercrime or all different kinds? Like what are the main areas that you deal with?
So I spent 8 years working on cybercrime. So I joined the National Cybercrime Unit just before the 2012 Olympics. So it used to be there was a Metropolitan Police cyber team and an NCA cyber team, and we joined that into one. And we had all sorts of responsibilities around the Olympics, and there was a big increased investment in cyber. The government sort of realised that cyber was a problem. And I spent 8 years working in cybercrime, and I've moved in April 2019 to help set up the National Economic Crime Centre. So the focus is on, it started out very much focused on money laundering and international money laundering. If you remember things like the Panama Papers, and there was concern about the reputation of the UK as a kind of centre of international money laundering. And if you want to launder your money, the place to go is London. And I think as the government changed and the current government has got a much more kind of domestic focus, our focus shift from sort of solely money laundering to considering fraud and MPs post bags increasingly a kind of, you know, I've been a victim of this specific fraud. So our focus has kind of shifted on from international money laundering, international bribery and corruption, which was a strong, bribery and corruption in particular was a strong focus for the Cameron government. Theresa May was very focused on money laundering, and now we're talking about fraud. So politics.
It's the same thing, you're saying?
Well, fraud, I think, is, I mean, the nature of the crime is international, but it manifests itself in a very domestic way.
So are you able to give us a nice example to kind of bring it down for people to relate to, like a good classic example of what goes on?
So I think it's probably, you can look at it two ends. There's kind of mass fraud and there's really targeted. So at the very targeted level, what we see is organised criminal groups. They will really, really target individuals. So if you are the chief financial officer of a business, and they will target you to try to get you to pay an invoice into the wrong account. If you are a high value customer of a big bank, they will try and get onto your computer to get hold of your login details so they can make a transaction from your bank. If you are a vulnerable individual who's kind of on the suckers list and is kind of repeatedly hit with individual fraud, you get targeted over and over again with someone turning up at your house saying you need to give them your debit card because it's not safe, phone calls, letters. But then at the other end, a significant proportion of particularly kind of internet-enabled fraud is just, we're going to send an email to 100,000 people and hopefully one of them clicks on a link. That could be anybody.
Right, so in all those cases, does your agency work that people smell a rat and they contact you, so in other words, you're reactive, or are you proactive that you can go and find it? Do you have methods of finding them in the process? Like, and if I can ask what they are,
so
how it works.
We're
Obviously anything you can tell us.
No, it's fine. So policing in the UK, 43 different police forces in England and Wales, they deal with reactive crime reporting. How it works is if you are a victim of fraud and you want to tell the police, City of London police run Action Fraud, which is a central service to tell them. So you call up or you email them or fill out an online form. They will take a look at your report, and if they think it needs a reactive investigation, that will go to a police force. What we do is we do two things. Firstly, as you say, we do proactive intelligence-led investigations. And that's one of the things that one of our kind of principles is that often a report of crime with fraud is often not the best place to start an investigation. Oh. So as a victim, it's really hard to understand what's happened. You might have clicked on a link a year ago, and then a year later, money's gone from your account. And to launch an effective investigation, we have to pull those two things together. As a victim, there's no way you're going to know that. So there's a whole proportion of this crime that's really, really hard to investigate if you only do it reactively. So what we're doing is we are using international relationships and working with all sorts of different private sector partners and counter fraud professionals and government to try and just understand who are the biggest fraudsters in the UK, who are the organised criminals that are behind this stuff, and how can we kind of proactively go after them. The other thing that we're responsible for is kind of running the system. So it's a really complicated system of police, government, the banks all have massive counter-fraud teams. You've got charities, you've got kind of the news, you've got the whole cyber world, people telling you to change your passwords. It's a massive world of people that want to do good. And sometimes we don't all work together that well, particularly when you add in tax fraud. So there's more investigators in HMRC than basically all the rest of us put together. Trying to kind of bring that together and make everybody work together nicely is the other part of what we do.
And is it being successful in that? In other words, for two things: is online fraud and these attempts going up, and are you able to chase it better? Are they trying new schemes the whole time, or are people realizing that it's just not worth the effort because of all you guys, what you're doing?
Oh no, I mean, well, so the problem is that it's definitely worth the effort.
Right,
so the problem is that the vulnerabilities and the opportunities are increasing faster than we're able to kind of react.
And that's as more people get connected. Is that the point?
Yeah,
and alternate ages and
exactly. And the nature of internet is that it's built for doing stuff. It's not really built for security. It's not really built to kind of create a secure operating environment for money. Internet is basically built to just do stuff really quickly. So
I think we've all noticed in our online banking, that there's more tests, more questions the whole time, and we'll have to remember our parents' maiden names and dogs' names and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly. It makes it easier because my mother apparently follows me around everywhere I go. That's unfair. No, I mean, so that's really interesting that you say that. The problem is that at the moment, a significant proportion of fraud is the individual actually making the payment themselves.
Right. In other words, being gullible. Right.
Yeah, exactly. So banking systems are set up to spot in really, really clever ways. That's not you, that's someone else. But what if I actually do want to move all my money?
Yeah. And they've actually been convinced to do it. Yeah. So what tips do you have for people to protect ourselves in terms of us? Well, what are the things that they try now? Because it'll often look like it. I know the bank says we'll never contact you, but there's calling the whole time, trying to convince them that it's you. What's the way to smell?
Yeah. So there's the first thing. I think you start with the cyber stuff. So the first thing is kind of look at your computer. And how you treat your personal information. So this the kind of basic cybersecurity advice: have good passwords, update your antivirus. When your computer or your phone actually asks you to run an update, and you go, "Oh, I'm bored, not now, I'm busy." Can we just do it because it's normally a security update? So the starting point is your online cybersecurity and where you put your data. So not clicking on bad links, not putting your data into bad places. And then there's there's the cyber bit, and then there's the personal element to it. So if landlines, landlines seem to only exist for fraud at the moment. Maybe that's a generational thing, but no one ever calls my landline is genuine. I would say in terms of the personal element, I think the bit that's really interesting, and I think we don't stress this enough in fraud advice, is the community element and the social element. So a really significant amount of fraud is stopped by people talking to other people about what's happening to them. And particularly with isolation at the moment, I think you're getting quite a lot of situations where people on their own are getting quite down the kind of route into a fraudulent scheme and making several different payments. They just mention it to someone else, and the other person goes, have you considered that might be a fraud? So there's a community and a social element to it that I think is really important, particularly intergenerational. Like, I mean, there's a false misconception that fraud is an old people's crime, and that's definitely not the case. Overconfidence is people in my generation. There's a trend, particularly of kind of men in their 30s investing their money in fraudulent investment schemes.
Really? Oh wow! I'm really surprised by that, actually. That's really interesting.
And there's often when they're told it's fraudulent, they sort of don't believe it, and people say, "Oh no, my money's coming in the future." So I think there's a perception of what a victim of fraud looks like, and it's not necessarily always the case.
Oh, okay, I understand. So if we always said we're going to call them back and not trust anything on the first time out, would that be a safe way of doing it?
Well, firstly, yes. I think the best way to avoid fraud is sort of just say no. I mean, sometimes you do actually want to do your business over the phone or whatever. I mean, the problem I think comes when the organisation you're working with isn't set up to deal with that kind of problem.
Right.
So, for example, one of the things we're dealing with at the moment is the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccination.
Right. So I wanted to ask you about how things are changing. Okay. So how's that? Yeah. Go on.
So for example, there's lots of different ways in which the NHS will contact you to ask you to come and get your vaccine, and you can't always call them back, and that makes it really hard. So, for example, if you're not sure it's the vaccination people on the phone, you say, I want to hang up and call you back. Well, you can't. And there's all sorts of complicated reasons why, but that just makes it really hard. And that's part of the reason why we're doing a lot of work at the moment, trying to educate people about this.
So what kind of vaccine for? People asking, they're trying to make you pay over the phone?
Well, there's a bit of that. The big one, we've actually, City of London have had thousands of reports of this week, it's an email. It seems to be one sort of email from the NHS. And it says, click here to book your vaccination. And if you look at it next to a kind of real NHS email, you can tell that it's not right, but you really have to seriously look at it. And you click on the link and it asks you for all the information you'd expect if you were booking a vaccine, and then just a few other little things like, your bank details or whatever. And there's different variants that are asking for slightly different stuff. The bit that's quite nasty is what is then happening in a number of cases is the individuals they put in their phone number, they then get a phone call saying, you've received an email fraud asking about the vaccination, it's not real. Now your money is not safe because you put in your bank details. I'm calling from the bank, you need to move your money into a safe account.
Oh no.
And it just feels real. There's so much about it that feels real. And the people that have lost money in the short term are the ones that have gone, oh my gosh, I need to move my money and it's not safe.
And do you catch a lot of these people? Are you catching them or not? So, if I can ask. I mean, and the question is, how do you catch them?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the first thing is, what we're having a lot of success at the moment is kind of online takedowns of this stuff that's out there. So bad content on the internet, there's this idea that the internet is some sort of cloud somewhere. Everything on a website is physically hosted somewhere.
Right.
Somewhere in the world, there's a server. When stuff gets reported to us, to the National Cybersecurity Centre in particular, which is part of GCHQ, they've got this suspicious email reporting system and all these sorts of clever systems to take down bad content. And one of the ways we measure success is how long it's up there for. And it used to be sort of days, and now we're talking hours. So we are really, really quickly taking down this stuff.
And when you take it down, you can chase the people that put it there. Anyway, is there contact details? How do you do that?
That's the hard bit.
Or they do fake.
Yeah. So the nature of the internet is you can very, very easily sign up for a domain with fake details. If you go to some of these domain sites like Domain Tools or whatever, you search for the number of Tony Blairs and Mickey Mouses who own domains, you'd be surprised.
Right.
So how do we find people? Well, it really depends on the nature of the crime. So we put a lot of work into a fraud called courier fraud, January, February, earlier this year. Courier fraud, last year.
Yeah.
Basically, courier fraud is where you get a phone call or some form of communication from your bank, and an individual from a courier company will arrive and they have to take your card from you because your card is no longer safe. And there's all sorts of kind of extensions to that, and particularly...
Why would your card not be safe? They just say to destroy the card. Well, I don't understand. Why would you...
I mean, it's particularly targeted at vulnerable people.
Right.
It's often, there's been a number of cases of individuals who get put in the back of a car and driven around towns and taken to cash machines. We've had a number of individuals with kind of special needs and learning difficulties that have been victim. It's a really nasty crime. Often there's threats of violence. There's all sorts of stuff. It's, it's the physical presence of the offender.
Right.
And we did a bit of work profiling how these organised criminal groups work. And they were basically travelling around the country on trains or in cars, turning up in an area, using kind of data. It's almost like, when you canvass for an election, and you kind of turn up in an area and you kind of, we think this is data they've kind of stolen and found online and targeting specific households in a specific area. And we work with the local police, looking at the data, who is travelling where, matching that against known offenders, known organised criminals, looking at financial movements and trying to get ahead and basically say, well, we think they're going to turn up in this area. And then you can be a bit reactive. And so if we say to Action Fraud, we want you to tell us about every single courier fraud report in Hertfordshire this week. And every single one, you flood the area. And we arrested 100 people because you go in, you target. The problem is, the Home Office say there's 43 different types of fraud. We pick that type because it's specifically the nature of the victims. It's really unpleasant. It's a particularly nasty form of fraud. But you can't adopt such a resource-intensive approach across 43.
Right.
It's the most commonly experienced crime in the UK, and I think part of the challenge we face is you can't prosecute your way out of the problem. So I mean, I haven't really answered your question. How do we catch online fraudsters? It's very difficult.
No, because what you're saying to me is saying that you gave that example, and you're saying that you work very fast to stop, online frauds that are doing it, but you're not necessarily catching the criminals, but you're stopping them from reaching the public.
Yeah,
I don't know if there's any way of going after them besides, as you say, these strategic methods. I don't know.
So it depends. So with the kind of organised online driven fraud, it depends on the location. So quite a lot of it is driven from hard to reach jurisdictions is the kind of euphemism. So Russia, China, places where we can't just sort of call up our colleagues in those foreign countries and say, can you possibly help us out? They say, no, what are you talking about? You've made up all this evidence or whatever. That's although it really depends. Inevitably, a kind of an element of the crime will involve somebody in the UK. And often that's the kind of cash out. So it's a lot, if you're a fraudster, quite hard to convince an individual and a bank to transfer money into an Afghani bank account. It looks much more genuine if you've got an army of British nationals with genuine high street banks, and you're able to make small level payments into those banks, and we call those money mules.
Money what?
Money mules.
Money mules, yes.
People whose job is just to have a bank account and to watch money coming and going and say, oh,
right.
I have no idea why that happens. Money just appeared in my account and I was told to transfer it somewhere else. I have no idea why. So there's elements that we can target, and then we go upstream. We say, right, who told you to do that? So we go after them.
And you build, right. Do you ever get any poachers turned gamekeepers, people you've caught who then help you, or is that just what happens on the TV?
No, that is real. So there's a few elements to it. There's people who are grey who, if you have a chat with them, will give you information because they want money or they want a lesser sentence.
Right.
People will, do anything for in real terms. People get involved in organised crime. Morals isn't really top of their list, so you can. That's useful sometimes. In terms of kind of reformed, I mean, I've heard a number of kind of reformed offenders who are kind of on the speaking circuit talking about why the law enforcement does such a bad job, and really if we only did it differently. There's a part of me that thinks you made money through fraud. Now you're making money through fraud, and you're just doing it in a different way.
Well, it sells them more, right?
Yeah.
But let me ask you, because from a Jewish point of view, and you said you're in the youth movement Noam, you've got a moral sense. Does that, when you come to work, is that irrelevant now? Is it just people just don't do it because they don't want to get caught? Is there any moral sense? Do you think our society is becoming less moral? Or it's just, there's always been crime, there's new forms of technology and they're applying them? Or do you think there's a change? Like, do you have a sense? If you don't want me asking.
No, it's a really good question. So I think the opportunities to commit crime are overwhelming. Right, and it's not just about fraud. I mean, if you look at, a lot of the stuff in the news in the last week around footballers receiving racist abuse, in the past, if you watched a game of football, you couldn't message the guy on the screen and tell him he was a whatever. You just didn't have the opportunity. Now you just set up an account in someone else's name, set up another email address, and you can use whatever language you want. That's an opportunity. So we don't have the opportunity to do what we used to do, or what some people, obviously not us, used to do, and go to the football stadium and shout abuse. But we do have the opportunity to severely harm another person through the words we use. So I think that the opportunities are there. I also think there's a what's the word? There's a certain megaphone element to it. Like if you went back 20 years and you continue the analogy, and you went to a football game and you threw a banana at a black player, or whatever you did, all right, all being well, that individual would be arrested and thrown out the ground and whatever. But we wouldn't be talking about it we wouldn't be talking about it on the news the next day. It wouldn't be 20 million people reading about this appalling event. And you could say, okay, well, education and, but also I think we give minority voices a lot of, the big platform. I mean, in terms of crime, in terms of organized crime, which is the area that we are looking at, I think there was this idea that and maybe it's glamorized on TV, organized crime has a certain sort of morality to it. I mean, family, sort of protecting yourself. I mean, okay, I would call it self-preservation rather than morality. I mean, organized criminal groups have always sought to self-preserve, and I think the nature of that has just changed. Final thing I'd say is they outsource. So the ability for criminals to outsource is really, really high, and more than it was, and to kind of access specialists. And that allows you to access a whole world of organized crime that previously, I think, if you sort of weren't in that world, you just think, don't know how. You just outsource.
Which is opportunity again.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think the vast amount of British citizens are law-abiding and don't want to do this kind of thing, or there's a hotbed of it and any opportunity people take? Like, when you come away from work, do you feel dirty? That's what I mean. Or do you feel no? Most people give information to the police and are helpful. Yeah. I just want to get a feel for how you see it.
It's a really good question. So I think we would be surprised that over such a high percentage of these sorts of crimes, particularly technical cybercrime, are perpetrated by a relatively small number of people who have the ability through technology to do really big damage. I mean, I don't come away from it sort of depressed. I used to, about 9 years ago, for a brief time, I worked on online child abuse stuff, which is pretty gruesome and horrible and whatever. It wasn't the content of it. Well, I think the thing that I found troubling was part of the role. You would sometimes have to read the stories of the kind of the chats of the individual who you knew to be an offender, who the other individual believed was a child, and you'd have to read the material to identify vulnerability, and you'd effectively read about this person being sucked in, and that's unpleasant, and it's quite hard not to sort of get carried away with the sense that it's just appalling. But again, you have to remind yourself, small number of people.
Yeah, no, that's good to know. And do you think your moral sense, does that come from your Judaism? Is it relevant for your work in any way? The fact that you're Jewish in your head, whether because of the way you look at it or because there are Jews out there doing these things?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I remember vividly sitting in my interview and being asked why they sort of thought, what was it about me that I thought would make me good at this role, and there's a part of me that thought, there's a very obvious anti-Semitic joke here, and I thought I was sort of making jokes to myself in the middle of an interview. I thought, not good. No, I mean, it's really, look, I mean, definitely a part of the moral element that comes from it is from my Judaism, but I would say I think it's a bit different. So the National Crime Agency and policing are operationally independent from government. So we are funded partly by government, and ministers decide how much money we've got, and they give us broad priorities. They say, look, we want to focus on modern slavery, and we want to focus on this, but they're not allowed to make individual operational decisions. You know, the Prime Minister can't call us up and say, can you stop investigating this? It's quite uncomfortable for me. Right. And often within that tension, that's actually the space in which morality lies. Where is it a minister saying, well, broadly for me, this is my priority? And where is it about the operational independence of us? And, you know, contractually, I'm a civil servant. And actually, as a civil servant, when are you doing what you're told? And when is it just, you know, as a Jew and as a liberal person, I'm not going to do that. And as a personal example, I kind of spoke to a colleague this week. There was a job, not for me, but a member of my team, in working on kind of organised immigration crime and dealing with issues around asylum seekers in the border. And she said to me, I'm absolutely not comfortable working in that policy environment because irrespective of the operational independence, I believe that our policy around asylum seekers and immigration is unethical. And I thought, actually, I probably agree with you. So, that's, it doesn't, I mean, it's quite easy to look at crime and say crime is bad, but it's that space where I sometimes feel a bit like I'm looking around at my colleagues and going, am I the only one thinking? I don't know. It's hard to know.
What are the priorities and how does it work? Yeah. Well, look, I'm going to open this up to the to ask questions. So we'll get your questions ready. But one final one. I don't really want to ask this, but we have to, which is there a higher prevalence of Jews for how many in the population? Is it a Jewish problem? What you've investigated, I don't really want to know. But I suppose if it's lower, I'd be happy to hear as well. It'd be nice to say that, you know, actually statistically Jews are lower or higher or average or whatever. But
there's a couple of things. So there's a couple of different elements, I would say. So in cybercrime, technical cybercrime is overwhelmingly dominated by Russian language, and for obvious reasons, you see a clear link to Israel.
Right.
For the number of Russian nationals living in Israel and the technological opportunities in Israel. So I was always a bit, you know, when I worked in cybercrime, there were always links to Israel. I don't think that's the kind of, you know, I think that's being blunt, like a link to Russian organized crime. And
I'm sure ultra-Zionists would say proud that Israeli technology is being used across the world in any context.
I mean, in terms of kind of, you know, sort of Jewish, I mean, so one of the things we see in money laundering is the critical role played by what we call professional enablers, who are bankers and lawyers and company formation agents and regulated
professional enablers. Yes,
you know, so you know, disproportionately, Jews make up a high percentage of those professions. Those professions are really valuable if you want to launder the profits of your drugs money. So yeah, I would say personally, I mean, I think there's a link to Judaism, but I think with what I've seen, that's about the fact that we are just prevalent in those sectors.
Involved in it, exactly. Okay, well, that's uncomfortable, but thanks for telling me. That's interesting to look at it in that kind of way. That word professional enablers worries me, but it's good to know. Okay, I'll open it for questions. Who wants to ask Ben their questions, whether it's about whether they've been frauded or advice or particular investigations you would like him to do? So we have some people want to come through.
Hello.
Yes, Margaret.
Shavua Tov. Hi, Ben. That was very fascinating, and I really felt a bit scared because a few months ago, in the midst of lockdown, early one morning, I got a phone call telling me this was my credit card and there'd been, they needed to have my security number because somebody had been playing on my card. So I said, well, they said to me, what's your card number? I said, surely you know that if you're phoning me. But had I been less aware, it would have been very, very dodgy. And I think, you know, I'm 70, so I think they must scout around, look at files and things and see who are the dodgy old women around that they can do this to. So now I'm very cautious and I don't answer any of these calls. And I said, send me an email if you have all my information. So thank you for your very interesting talk. You're very young to be doing all this.
Thank you. I don't know. I mean, just on that. So one of the things that we see is one of the things that we're seeing at the moment is sort of people think, how did I end up on this list? So investment scams in particular are a way that often this starts. So we're trying to we work a lot. Well, we're trying to work more with organisations like Google and others, because unregulated investment products get advertised high up a Google search. It's quite hard to know if they're fraudulent or not. They want to get you to sign up. You sign up, you put in your details. Even if they get identified as fraudulent and 2 hours later they get pulled down, the fraudsters have your details and they might sell them to other fraudsters.
Right.
And, it's like a phone book. It's really, 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 really difficult.
That's interesting, Ben, because actually Martin just asked on this issue related to Google. He asked, does your agency have access or pay companies like Google, who he thinks possibly have algorithms to spot fraud and have intra-email search that can help with intelligence? Did you do that, or?
Yeah. So we don't pay Google. I don't think they need our money. But so it's a complicated relationship. So Google, as a company, and I can kind of talk about other companies, but Google is most prevalent in investment scams, because investment scams, particularly like buy Bitcoin or this new cryptocurrency or whatever, are often advertised online because people tend to try. It's quite common. You want to invest your money online, so paying Google to put your fraudulent product quite high up the Google search is quite common. It's quite hard for the Financial Conduct Authority, and it's quite hard for Google to know that that's fraudulent, because the people offering that scheme were just going to say, well, yeah, if it's investment, you might lose your money. And identifying what's a Ponzi scheme and what's just a guy that you're giving your money to and he's running away, and what's a genuine investment product and what's regulated is quite hard. So Google say, look, this is very hard for us. I don't know. I take the view that if you look at an organisation that's making money off something, well, what's their incentive? Other types of fraud are much more linked to social media rather than Google. So I haven't talked about romance fraud, which is like the most tragic of all fraud types, where people genuinely believe they're in a relationship with somebody who is stealing their money. That's extremely so the dating industry is really on board. They're really behind that because they have an incentive to make their platforms appear safe. So we work really closely with sort of dating websites. They're brilliant. But then social media, Facebook, completely different environment. They don't have a financial incentive to kind of stop people committing romance fraud on their platforms. So it's really, there's a lot of variety. My sort of instinct is that everybody cares about child protection. Everybody wants to be seen. When it comes to money, I'm not sure everybody has the same opinion.
Okay. I've got other questions anyway, but I could see that Larry, is it? Larry never have their hand up. They want to ask.
It's Larry this time.
Go on, Larry.
Okay, so I would say, first of all, thank you for the excellent presentation. I would say 50% of the calls we get on our landline are from somebody, sounds like they're in India, purporting to be either from Amazon or Microsoft. So and clearly they're not. And so a couple of questions for you. One, does it pay to play along with them to try to extract some information to pass on to police, or should just one hang up, unless one has nothing better to do? And B, what type of, outreach has the UK government done to the Indian government to try to stop these centers?
Yeah, if I can start with it, I just can't resist telling this story. So I went over to India to personally have this conversation. It's happened at a more senior level, but I had a lovely time, fantastic place. But there's the NCA's overseas officer at the time was a British Asian lady. And there was myself, and somebody commented that I looked young. And we went into this, Indian culture is fantastic, but can be quite hierarchical. And we went into the meeting room with the minister, and he says, not realizing that my representative from the embassy can understand what he's saying. He turns to his assistant. He says, "Am I talking to the child? Who am I meeting with? Is it the child or the woman?" So we went. She berated him in I think it was Hindi, and he sort of went ooh, and we had a very successful meeting. That was a very memorable experience. Anyway, the other thing I'd add is one of the fascinating things that happened is the beginning of the first lockdown in India, all of that crime basically stopped. Everybody stopped receiving those phone calls because the call centers in India, everybody was at home. So we've said for some time, these are fraudulent call centers in India and their business is crime. And computer service software fraud, your computer, there's a problem with your computer, that's a big one. I need to remote access. City of London Police lead on this, and they've had some really good successes working with the Indian government and Indian police. It's really, really hard. It's hard work. International investigations are difficult. As are my bosses have been clear, the exit from the European Union doesn't make that any easier. But these cases take time and they're not straightforward. The best thing you can do, I mean, so the first part of your question was, should I waste their time? Well, yeah, it's always, I mean, it's good fun to waste their time. I doubt you'll get any useful information out of them. The risk is that if they think you're a sucker, they might keep calling you. You can put your phone number onto call blocker lists. I think Ofcom and the Information Commissioner's office do stuff like that. And that, I think from people have told me that does actually work.
Yeah, BT provide that service.
Okay, I want to ask as well here, because Leanne's saying something very well. She said, yesterday, someone tried to hack into my bank account via text message. They had my account number. How did they find that out?
Oh, good question. So if they had partial access, so one of the things that happens, you probably read in the news, data breaches. So these big cyber attacks on companies that have lost lots of data online. So TalkTalk was one that happened quite a while ago, which I dealt with. It was ruined my weekend. The British Airways one, they got a big fine from the Information Commissioner recently. So I was actually a victim of that myself. Or you get was it Experian, Equifax? I can't remember. One of those two suffered a big data breach. So what happens is these companies have databases with our data on it. They get hacked through highly technical cyber attack by extremely competent criminals. Criminals get hold of millions of amounts of credit card, account numbers, passwords, emails. They can't do anything with them on their own. If you steal 10 million credit card numbers, you can't go shopping with 10 million people's credit cards. So you sell them. As I said, you outsource the crime to someone else. And what happens is this data that's stolen somewhere, and this is why GDPR and the Information Commissioner's office take this stuff really seriously. It leads to crime miles down the line, and it's so hard to track it and understand how. And you think, how the hell have these people got hold of my data? And maybe a year ago, you got an email from British Airways saying, oh, we're really sorry that we got hacked into and someone stole all your data. And you think, oh, that's fine, nothing's happened. And then a year later, you get this letter, and it's like, well, maybe that came from that. It's really hard to tell. We tried to do a piece of work this year trying to track that, and it's just really hard.
Okay. Question from Betty. Are there any particular websites, e.g. gambling sites or dating sites, which make you more vulnerable to cybercrime?
I can't really say that because every website is so different.
Betty, I know I'm implied that you go on those sites, you know.
I mean, it's not really,
and dating.
Yeah.
It's good to know.
It's not really a sector. So there's a few sort of basic bits of advice that I think make a big difference. One is keep your password to your email account separate to everything else. Because often your email account is the one that resets all your other ones. So if your criminals want to reset password somewhere else, if they've got your email account, they can just say, oh, I forgot my password, and they can then get access to everything. So keep your email password separate from everything else, which makes you much more likely to be safe. If someone hacks into your Sainsbury's account, all right, that's a shame. The way that most credit card data is protected through encrypted payments, the likelihood is it's probably not going to be the online payment platform that gets hacked. It's probably unlikely. The other good bit of advice that people now say is to use a password manager. I mean, it's sort of counterintuitive. You think, oh my God, I put all my passwords in one place. But
yeah, I'm very nervous of that.
Yes, and a lot of people are. There's a really, really good blog written extremely sensibly at the National Cybersecurity Centre that explains why password managers are a good idea. And it's just because people are people, and you will reuse your passwords. and the likelihood of that being the problem as opposed to your password manager being hacked.
Okay. I mean, a follow-on question for that was, are bank staff part of fraud with these kind of issues, or is that a problem we find, bank staff doing it, or?
So we actually had a case 2 weeks ago. Which is at the public domain. We put out a press release explaining that a employee at a bank was helping individuals to fraudulently obtain COVID-19 related government grants, the bounce back loan scheme. So that individual was arrested with the help of the bank. So it was at the top of my mind. It was literally 2 weeks ago, and it was a banking insider who was defrauding the bank by helping individuals to steal the money. Broadly, that's not really something we've seen that often. Insiders seem to be much more involved in market abuse, so kind of insider trading, that sort of thing. Insider trading cases are fascinating but extremely difficult. Oh, someone's just sent around the password manager thing, which is great. Yes, that's exactly the one I was thinking of.
Oh, that's good. And there's a question from Brian, which I think is an interesting one as well. So I would like to ask about the role of the courts, right? In your experience, are fraud cases too complicated for juries? Are sentences too light? How's that side of it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the first problem is getting the case to court in the first place is really, really hard. So the UK legal system has something called disclosure, which is an obligation on the prosecution to disclose anything to the defence that could materially affect either the prosecution or the defence. So if we're investigating you and we find something that shows you're not guilty, we have to give that to you. So in order to be able to fulfill our disclosure requirements, we have to have, to a degree, looked at everything that we have. So if you're trying to prosecute a complex case, particularly, the classic is a cybercrime, you go into the person's bedroom and they've got 9 computers. The first thing the defense solicitor will say is, I'd like my disclosure, please. And you go, because how are you going to look through everything? It's really, really complicated. So meeting the legal obligations of disclosure to allow for a fair trial require the prosecution to examine often a vast amount of information, or to come up with rules to say, well, this is the reason why I chose not to look at this material. And the judge will say, okay, I agree with you. So the first hardest thing we find is actually getting a case to court is really, really difficult because they're complicated. You have to work with the prosecutor from day one. The worst thing that happens is 2 years later, this is going to get to court. I think the skill of a good prosecutor and a good investigating witness, and I've seen this in extremely technical cases, is to explain what's happened in very simple terms. And I would query the idea that judges understand more about fraud and cybercrime than ordinary members of the public who will find themselves on juries. If you sit there and explain to the judge some of the ways in which we obtain evidence through computers, the judge is going to look at you going, I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. So I think probably the most important thing is to have a specialist fraud prosecutor rather than necessarily the judge and jury, because the skill is to really simply explain, and they want to know what happened, who did what, and how do you know?
Right, so it's changing. Okay, I'm conscious of time here, so I think we have to begin to wrap up. But Ben Tobin, you've got a question. Do you want to ask it verbally? Because I didn't quite understand what you're referring to, the action fraud.
Yeah, there was a lot of, you mentioned City of London Police. There was a lot of criticism about a year ago of the City of London Police and action fraud, I think, which was criticising them. Is that still valid? The other thing, in passing, I would say in my work, I'd come across a lot of fraudulent property investment schemes. And I get called by the victims and I say to them, did you never think that this all looked a bit too good to be true? A return of 10% and your money guaranteed and all your money back in 12 months. And if it looks too good to be true, it probably is.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah. So firstly on that, yes. And actually at the moment, we're working with the FCA, we're doing a big, it's called Scam Smart campaign. Basically the premise is interest rates are really low. Like, there's a clue there. And that actually makes our job a bit easier because anyone who's claiming to offer you a high, anybody who's offering a high interest rate is automatically basically putting themselves up to be investigated. Just, you know, in a high interest rate environment, it's a bit harder to know. In terms of action fraud, so I don't work for the City of London Police. I work very closely with them. What happened is a newspaper. It was their call centre was outsourced to one of these companies that runs everything in our lives. A newspaper got one of their journalists to get a job in the call centre, and they recorded the training, which was awful. The training was basically like training managers saying, "Oh, all these people are just stupid, and these victims of crime. Oh, God, can you believe some of this stuff? These people are idiots." And really saying, just take the details, and we get paid if we, get through the calls quickly. It was just, everything you don't want to hear. So that was released to the public. They sacked the contractor. They hired a new call center. They've got all the, daylight is often the best, whatever the expression is. Someone will finish it for me. Thank you. So there's a new contractor in place. And I think that criticism of action fraud is no longer justified. I think what is challenging is people say, I reported this to action.
Ben, thank you so much. And we could go all night talking about crime. But thank you very much. Sorry,
I lost my connection. I'll stop.
Well, we can see you. Well, you're not moving. Are you back?
Right. Can you hear me all right?
Okay. No, I want to thank you, Ben, for that. That was interesting. Some way scary, reassuring that it's not everybody. But even because we hear so much of this in the news, we might get panicked about that. But we can't be too careful in how we're checking things. And even if people have our bank account details or some extra details, still phone back, double, triple check, and to find out what's going on. It's definitely a key issue. But thank you very much, and I wish you Patzlacha in your work. You're doing God's work, you should know. But no, the sense of morality in society, it's a fundamental question, which I always find. Do most people not commit crimes because they think it's morally wrong and they're decent, or they don't want to get caught? There is sometimes research that's done on these kind of things, but I still like to believe, I think there's a lot of truth, there's a lot of decency out there. People just want to be left alone and do the right thing. So thank you so much for what you do as well. And what's happening, Edward, in the future? Do we have some plans for the next coming weeks? Do you want to tell us what's
Yes,
going on?
I can tell you that.
Over to you, Ben.
Next week, we have a guy called Edwin Schuker, who is the Vice President of the Board of Deputies. I'm sure that's a wonderful thing, but I think he's got much more interesting stuff to talk about. He was born in Baghdad. He goes back to Baghdad often. He interacts with the government there. He's very involved in the history of Jews in Baghdad, and he's made a film about it. He's a very interesting guy.
No, yeah, I know Edwin very well, and he's very interesting. And when I was in Israel once, and he kind of goes off and does lots of private meetings with very interesting people. And he just gets on and does things, and he's a fascinating man. So that's really, really interesting. So thanks very much for organising this, Ben, and thank you, Ben Russell, for coming on. And I wish you all a Shavua Tov, and have a good week. Everybody be safe in every sense of the word, as we've learned from tonight. And see you next week, please God. Be safe and be well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ben.